Right, so good afternoon, everybody who's joining us, continue to stay with us, I should say, for this 2.5-day summit by the Pacific Basin Economic Council for 2022. And we've had some amazing discussions already this morning and this afternoon, where we've already had two of our one-to-one dialogue fireside chats. The first one we kicked off with Hong Kong. Australia has just finished, and now we come on to Singapore. And I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by Sharad, Somani, who's the KPMG partner and ASPAC head of infrastructure advisory and based down in Singapore. Unfortunately, Thomas Knudsen, who is the managing director for Toll Asia Pacific, he couldn't be with us today. Unfortunately, he did come down with COVID. We won't blame him for that because he was traveling around the region, and I think even our own chief executive here in Hong Kong caught COVID while he was visiting APEC in Thailand. So it goes to show that it is still around in the region and in the world, and that we shouldn't take it too lightly, as I've had it myself, and it's not the best thing to have. So and we're not going to get into that today about vaccinations or the rest of it, but Sharad, I think with just the two of us, we spoke before in the preparation for this call, really to give your perspective from where you're sitting in Singapore, because even in today's dialogues this morning, Singapore is coming up quite often already. We had the water session a little bit earlier, and UNICEF is teaming up with water from the water perspective with the Singapore government, because obviously we were talking about before of like Singapore hasn't got anything, what we would say, material to export per se at volume. But what it does have is intellectual property and this know-how of coming from what was relatively a poor island state in their own right only several decades ago to now being one of the most prosperous islands nations in the region. So maybe you want to touch upon some of what Singapore is doing to continue this road, if you like, of digitalization, technology, being ahead of the curve on technological advances, and exporting their IP and their know-how in certain sectors.
Sure, Michael. Good afternoon, all, and thank you for inviting me to this session. So, Michael, to respond to your question, I think what is happening is, if you look at the region broadly and globally, there's a lot of focus moving to cities, right? Urban infrastructure and cities are becoming an important part of the economy. And if you look at Singapore, the big three focuses by sectors I will talk about first, and then we can discuss specifically on what's happening in each of those sectors. The first big sector that Singapore is focused on quite extensively is energy and utilities, right? So it's power, water, and waste. And this is very critical as we move forward, and it becomes all the more important as we look at a decarbonized world, right? What's happening to the energy, water, and waste sector. So we can talk about that. And Singapore has definitely done a lot of stuff in that area. We can talk about specific case studies and how potentially cities in the region can benefit from that experience. The second big pillar to my mind is transport, right? And transport and energy together are probably the biggest contributor to greenhouse gases. And cities will have to address that challenge head on. In transport space, I think how to transition from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles and how to create the infrastructure for EV charging is going to be an important debate going forward. And that's another area where Singapore has done fabulously well in terms of putting the sowing the seeds, so to say, to drive that journey to decarbonization of transport as a sector. And the third thing, more importantly, I guess, is the real estate built environment, right? Where the buildings are great emitters of greenhouse gases. And how do we address greening of buildings, right, is going to be a key challenge. And in Singapore, there was the launch of the Singapore Green Plan 2030, where by 2030, 80% of our buildings will be green. And that is an important, again, opportunity for not only the businesses, but also the region to pick up and green the sector. So these three big sectors of energy, utilities, transport, and buildings, green environment will drive the agenda going forward for the region as well.
And maybe a couple of other points there you raised when we were talking as well was that transition of finance requirement.
Yep.
And which part of the ESG sort of transition as well, because typically finances are putting requirements on finance these days. Be in line with ESG standards and the targets, the scientific based targets as well.
Yes.
So I mean, we talked a lot about, capital markets. I think, where does Singapore sit as a capital market raiser in terms of infrastructure funded projects in particular? Do you feel Singapore is doing enough, or do you feel they still look to like London or even Hong Kong to raise infrastructure capital? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, okay, no, that's an important point. So I think the underlying theme on all the sectors would be digitalization and green financing, right? And these are critical pillars for us to drive the transition that we want to achieve. If you look at Asia as a whole, we have been quite underrepresented in terms of capital market financing of infrastructure projects, right? So unlike North America and Europe, where pension funds, insurance companies will regularly invest in long duration infrastructure projects, we do not see that happening in Asia as yet. Of course, Malaysia has had some bond issuances for infrastructure projects, but broadly, I think the capital markets have not been tapped. We started with a business trust proposition where a lot of infrastructure assets will put in the infrastructure business trust, which will then issue the units in the capital markets. And that was a good avenue for retail investors to invest in infrastructure. I think going forward, what is interesting is Singapore has announced that all the long-term multi-generational infrastructure projects will have to be funded through long-term bond issuances by individual procuring agencies. And that is why you will see a deluge of bonds happening, particularly green bonds by agencies like NEA, which has done a green bond for integrated waste management facility. HDB and PUB, which are the housing and the water statutory boards respectively, are doing bond issuances regularly to fund the green infrastructure that they're developing. So clearly, one of the key focuses is going to be tapping institutional capital for financing of infrastructure projects. If you have green projects, then tap on that pool of money available and drive that infrastructure growth. What is also happening is alternate sources of capital, like direct financing by pension funds and insurance companies, both as equity and mezzanine, is also going ahead quite well. You would have seen that the Canadian pension funds are becoming comfortable with the infrastructure risk in the region, isn't it? And they're investing in a lot of projects. So to my mind, the capital markets and the institutional capital will drive the financing of infrastructure in the region. And Singapore has had some good successful examples in that direction.
And then, so capital markets to one side for a second, but if we come back to going into the specific sectors for where financing is most needed, if you like. So we touched upon it a bit there in terms of the water utility side of Singapore teaming up with organizations like an NGO like UNICEF to tackle some of the issues in developing countries. But what about energy? Obviously energy security is something that we're now all aware of globally, just because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the effect it's had on gas and coal price. Well, not coal so much, but just electricity prices in general.
Yeah.
Again, coming back to something we touched upon in the build up to this, was Singapore is really pushing the boundaries, if you like, the envelope on the transition to a greener, decarbonized economy. And we talked about they're taking a leap of faith, if you like, into hydrogen in particular. And we also talked about, like, obviously in the short term, LNG is in high demand, liquid natural gas, and you've got certain providers in the region already. And I think you mentioned from Indonesia, was it, that Singapore was importing at the moment? But the question was, and it comes back to building as well, we tie into is the refurbishment argument. Could buildings and existing pipelines carry some of the new gases, as well as can building infrastructure where they're saying to go green instead of rebuilding completely from scratch and using the latest materials? Can there be a better policy to incentivize renovation?
Yeah, no, I think that's very important, Michael. And there's a lot of thought process going between regulators, utilities, and policymakers in that direction. Talking specifically about Singapore, 99% of our generation happens to natural gas, right? And bulk of it is imported from Malaysia and Indonesia. I think energy security, as you rightly highlighted, together with affordability and sustainability, are becoming the key pillars for energy strategy going forward. Singapore has already committed to 2030 net zero or 2050 net zero and peaking of emissions by 2030. which effectively means that we'll have to look at energy sector quite closely to transition away from natural gas to hopefully greener fuels. And the two-pronged approach is, one is, of course, importing renewable energy from the region. So there's a big tender going on that. And second is putting bets on green hydrogen, right? Low carbon hydrogen moving into green hydrogen, starting with potentially ammonia to take care of the shipping bunker fuel, and then moving to power sector as and when the technology allows. The real challenge is twofold, right? One is transportation and second is storage. And currently both these technologies are in its infancy. There are a number of pilot projects being initiated. Simple electrolyzers being funded. There's a lot of R&D grant being provided in Singapore. But the question, I guess, going forward is how to repurpose the infrastructure, given that a strong LNG natural gas infrastructure has been created. Is it going to be possible to upgrade that infrastructure to carry hydrogen or a mix of hydrogen with natural gas going forward? We'll have to explore that. And there's a lot of research happening on that, a lot of investments going in that space. The second important question is, in what form do we bring hydrogen? If the conversion efficiency of liquefied hydrogen is going to be not that great and it's going to be expensive, then what are the other media of transporting hydrogen will have to be evaluated. There are CCGT, the combined cycle gas turbines being launched, which are hydrogen ready in Singapore. The question would be, when would that switch be possible and to what extent can we switch? Given that those two perspectives, I think the next 7 to 10 years become very, very important in our journey to evolve solution for green hydrogen as a fuel. And we believe that with the focus, concentration, and the kind of quantum of investment being made, there is a possibility of some great breakthroughs happening, which will make hydrogen production, transportation, and storage much easier, thereby bringing it as a mainstream fuel in coming years. And all countries in the region have to work in that direction, because the challenge what Singapore has is not different from what other countries have, right? They also have to move away from fossil fuel towards more greener option. And this is where a regional approach will be more powerful than a country-specific approach.
So coming to education for a minute, we didn't really talk about that actually before in our pre-call, but I just wanted to get your opinion on where you feel Singapore sits in terms of the educational space, because again, from our earlier dialogues, that's a big thread that's coming through, is next generation, training the next leaders in order to, in some ways, sustain the current trends within either even just supply chains and sourcing, manufacturing, but I think also in computer science, data scientists and all that. Do you have an opinion on that? Obviously, you're sitting in the infrastructure space, but you're also looking for talent coming through.
Yes.
Is the educational system fit for purpose for what you're needing?
No, Michael, I think that's an extremely great point you have raised. And in fact, we have been discussing that with a number of policymakers as well. A few years back, we were discussing whether there'll be enough engineering talent to run plants and utilities in Singapore, because everybody wants to become a banker or go for more of a white collar job rather than roughing it out in the industry. And that has meant that the engineering education has not been very, very attractive for a number of reasons. So the two big challenges I see within the education field, where all of us have to poke efforts, one is getting the right technical talent out, because all these things that we're talking about, renewable energy, grid stability, importing hydrogen, storing hydrogen, will require a fair bit of brain power on technology engineering side. The second is more on the digitalization aspect as well, right? You have to retrain your people to understand how digital transformation will work and impact their work life going forward, isn't it? So a lot of players we talk to in the utility space are very, very concerned and fearful of digitalization, right? But that's a fact of life. We have to leverage technology for better delivery of infrastructure services. So education and capacity development in these two areas, where we can bring the right engineering technical talent, as well as we can upgrade the skills of our existing people and be more digitally ready, will be very, very important. In this regard, I think a number of initiatives are ongoing. I think capacity development from multilaterals is happening. The regular exchange of people and deployment of people on various projects across geographies is happening. I think some concentrated effort in the areas of green hydrogen, decarbonization, and green financing would definitely help to drive that agenda.
No, I mean, I agree. I totally, on the educational side, it seems to be a common thread that was coming through in every country, if you like. It's a challenge of just, I think because of COVID rather than, I mean, we spoke about COVID right at the beginning because of one of our speakers can't be here today, but COVID just accelerated over a period of 2 years what normally would happen over maybe space of 10 or 12 years. And therefore, even those who were in education, you felt sorry for them who were trying to graduate during these offline period where they kind of didn't even get to enjoy what we know as to be university life, about making friendships for life. They kind of just had this Zoom or Teams experience. So I do feel sorry for them, but it does come back to, you know, business schools and other education institutions. In some ways that kind of forms part of a country's engagement in the region. You look at institutions like Monash University from Australia, they have campuses all around now Asia, in Indonesia and Malaysia. And I'm just wondering, because I'm not familiar with this, Singapore, obviously everybody knows NUS, very famous in getting involved with policy and stuff, but do you work with academic institutions there in Singapore at KPMG on initiatives to sort of bring through the next generation?
Yeah, we do. So there are two ways we get associated with schools. One is, of course, we do guest lectures and get the people to do internship with us, because internship is the best route to hiring people, isn't it? Where we both sides get to know each other. And we do run extensive programs with NTU, NUS, and SMU, the three big schools in Singapore. But the second respect, we do work on specific projects and initiatives that require academic rigor for industrial projects, right? So some of the path-breaking projects that we are working on, including, let's say, green hydrogen applications in emerging economies, right, which requires a fair bit of research. We do get some of the academic institutions and experts involved in that space. And this is a good way to kind of start that thinking where it's not only the academics are current in terms of what they are teaching their people, but also with exposure to industry, it becomes a win-win proposition where we also benefit from the latest models and techniques that are being taught in the schools. We want to continue that thing. It is not happening at the level that we would like, but my belief is as we move forward in an uncertain world where a lot of business successes will depend on how we chart our decarbonization roadmap or digitalization roadmap, more partnership at different levels will definitely help fast track that journey.
Can I just interrupt there on that point about decarbonization, just to highlight to the audience? You talked quite a bit about embedded carbon, and that was kind of a new phrase for me. I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit more what that means. And we also talked obviously about carbon capture. In fact, after our conversation, I spoke to Kowloon Dairy, a family business here in Hong Kong that still has dairy farms, but in the Guangdong region, and then obviously distributed via Hong Kong to the region. And she was really interested into hearing the latest about these carbon capture methods. But I mean, obviously that's more on the methane side. What's out there today? What are you seeing? What are the next sort of initiatives to combat decarbonization from a technology point of view?
Okay, no, let's touch on those two issues. So one is on embedded carbon, right? I think the level of the quality of debate has moved away from what is your carbon footprint to actually figuring out where exactly is your carbon footprint originating and how you can optimize it. A lot of focus used to be on operational carbon, right? Meaning that how much carbon you're emitting on your day-to-day life, right? What we want to encompass is a life cycle carbon footprint, meaning that if a building is constructed, how much is the embedded carbon in all the processes and procurements that happen to construct a building in the first place, right? So before even it's handed over for occupancy, what is the carbon that has been embedded in the building? And that calculation is very important, because unless we know that, we will not be able to optimize the supply chain or get the right products and services, isn't it? In fact, at KPMG, we run a tool called KPMG Origins, which actually helps calculate the actual embedded carbon in a real estate project, let's say. And as a planner, as an investor, you can then think through how to optimize that carbon through better procurements, more sustainable procurement, and that kind of stuff. And this is also very good for not only developers, but also financiers who are looking for more sustainable green solutions when they're when they're financing infrastructure projects. So that one aspect we should start looking at holistically across life cycle for all infrastructure asset classes, right? It could be a road project, it could be electric vehicle, for example, where we should know what is the actual embedded carbon in that before even it hits the road. The other aspect which we need to think through is talking about the broader decarbonization journey, right? What kind of green solutions we can offer. And this is where I think it's important to think through at the industry level, how do you benchmark the decarbonization pathways? I think it's very easy to say that we will be net zero by 2050, but what is it that you'll do in the next 3 years, 5 years to address the low-hanging fruits, right? Would be important. And this is where we learn from other industries, other sectors who can provide some good use cases. So one of the tools that we have developed is a decarbonization pathways tool for industry, where we know where you are starting from, what's your starting point, what your end goal is, and how can you reach that end goal within the time committed. And this is one of the things which is keeping all the board members awake, isn't it? Because they have gone and committed on a deadline, but they don't know how it's going to be achieved. And they don't know what kind of disruptions will impact the business if you don't do it on time. And carbon tax in Singapore, as you know, is going to grow 5-fold in the next 2 years, from $5 to $25, potentially going up to $80. Which effectively mean that it will have huge financial implications for companies which are not able to adapt their ways of doing business and decarbonizing the value chain. So that will be an important aspect as well.
And you touched upon before with me was some examples of foreign companies choosing Singapore when it comes to data in particular. So we talked about data centers, some of the big American corps have chosen Singapore as a destination, but obviously they take up a lot of heat and electricity, but they obviously are also looking to decarbonize as well and have zero emissions in their operations. So how anything you can share there on your client side that you're familiar with?
Sure. So there are two big trends happening, Michael. One is, of course, RE100, right? All the companies which have signed up for 100% renewable energy procurement are now becoming big clients of KPMG because they are looking for avenues to procure green power. It can be virtual PPA or it can be direct procurement. But that is the top agenda for them to completely get renewable energy. Now, Singapore, as you know, doesn't have enough renewable energy, right? So we'll have to look at either power imports physically, or look at virtual PPAs, or look at renewable energy certificates, right? Which is what we are involved in. But the second point about data center is very important, right? Data centers, as you know, there is a temporary ban on data centers in Singapore, primarily because we don't have enough green power. Now, green data centers is a big agenda for all the big companies, and they want 100% green energy to power up the data center. The interesting trend we have seen is talking to data center operators is a number of them are now looking at investing in renewable energy platforms to secure their source of green power, right? So we're talking of big 4 gigawatts of power coming into Singapore, for example, and renewable energy from other countries. It is interesting to see that a number of data center operators are saying that how do I secure my future by locking into some of these long-term procurements, not only as a buyer, but potentially as an investor. I think we should be open to those convergences happening where technology companies go and invest in energy companies primarily because they feed into each other, isn't it? And with this new pot of money becoming available to the sector, I see a number of good opportunities for driving that innovation in the renewable energy space also happening, because there's an urgency to drive that agenda.
And just as we come towards the end of our session already, it's just going flying by these sessions, but I wanted to talk about, standard of living, cost of living, because, Singapore, whilst it's really has rolled out the red carpet to attract foreign investment, foreign companies to come to Singapore, and maybe even taking advantage of Hong Kong's short-term demise, which has now come to an end, you'll be pleased to know, and we're now back in business in Hong Kong. But what's it like being there? Have you sensed the inflationary pressures in Singapore, and do you feel that that's something the government needs to monitor, where the the lower end of the population who don't necessarily can be involved in all of these great new initiatives. Maybe they don't have the education or they don't have the opportunity. Could they be left behind, and there could be, a bit of a social divide occurring in Singapore if they're not careful? Do you see that at all, or the government's fully aware of that?
No, I think, Michael, I think that there are two aspects, right? One is, of course, external imposed inflationary pressure, right? Where it's because of energy prices or rising interest rates, or influx from other countries into Singapore, that is leading to some inflationary pressure. But the second aspect is also homegrown, right? If you have carbon tax going up, if you have less GST going up, then those things will put pressure also on the cost of living. I think government is extremely mindful of this, and a few things that government is doing is, of course, there are rebate vouchers being given to underprivileged class where they can defray the cost of utility increase, for example. Government is also committed to channelize the entire funds raised from carbon tax into helping mitigate some of the impacts of carbon tax on the society and the industries. So it will be a zero-sum game as far as the carbon tax is concerned to drive the right behavior. So I think while the inflationary pressures are quite high, I think there is a fair bit of commitment by the government to at least take care of underprivileged sections of the society and defray some of the increased costs so that the day-to-day life is not impacted in any big fashion.
Okay, and if we were to look at 2023 to 2025, or even just 2023, because I think these days it's so hard to look that far ahead. But so things, what would you want the audience to take away from your side in terms of, and I'm not asking for a prediction, but what are you looking forward to in the next 12 months where you sit in Singapore?
So we are very bullish. I know there are a lot of headwinds in the economy, so we have to take it with a pinch of salt, in the sense that we have to see whether the geopolitical developments in the region and oil price impact doesn't impact the economic growth too much. But going forward, I think in spite of the headwinds of inflation and energy prices, we believe that there'll be a lot more focus on decarbonization and digitalization across the infrastructure as a sector. And it's quite heartening to see a number of utilities in the region, whether it's Vietnam or Indonesia or Thailand, focusing their energies on expanding their decarbonization footprint in terms of investing in new renewable energy technologies, and also focusing on digitalization of the company or the industry. So these two trends are big for us, digitalization and decarbonization going forward.
Well, I've just draw it to a close there, Sharad. I want to thank you so much for your time, and I can't wait to get down to Singapore. It used to be probably one of my most routine destinations, and I think there are regular flights now again, thankfully, between Hong Kong and Singapore. And I saw the amazing profitability figures of Changi Airport and Singapore Airlines. So there's hope for Cathay and Hong Kong Airport on the back of that. So we didn't really touch too much on aviation, which is obviously my background, but I know Singapore is doing extremely well in, I guess, taking some of the connecting routes as well. You know, Hong Kong and Singapore have always been known for that as a connector from Europe to Australia and New Zealand, but also trans-Pacific. So we've been working with other organizations in Latin America, which I spoke to you about before, in connecting potential new cargo routes via Japan, for instance, in America, to add to these consolidated distribution hubs. So we look forward to more engagement cross-border, with Singapore being very active in the foreign policy area with the Pacific Alliance Trade Agreement, Pact, and RCEP and CPTPP, which are all very important with what PBEC stands for in promoting trade from a business perspective. So with that, thank you so much, Sharad, for today, and thank you to KPMG for being a platinum sponsor for our event this year. And we look forward to hearing more from you, Sharad, and please share any reports that you're going to be sharing, distributing in Singapore. Make sure they get over to us here in Hong Kong as well.
Will do. Thank you, Michael, for inviting me.
Thank you.
Pleasure
Take
talking
care
to you.
and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care. Thank you.
Take care.